Okay, we're just waiting to get a quorum of at least 6, so we're about one person short. So the vice chair hopefully shows up. We can get going. Very good. Okay, guys, we're going to get started for our Chesapeake Bay restoration briefing, a very significant issue for our state, and we have 3 separate panels. And we're going to start with 2 witnesses from the Chesapeake Bay Commission. We've got Mark Hoffman, the Maryland director, and Anna Kilias, the new executive director of the Chesapeake Bay Commission. So, Mr. Hoffman, why don't you start? And I think we're pretty much at full membership here. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's great to be here today. Thank you. Welcome to this committee. We've been testifying before it for many years, and it's great to see everyone. Welcome to the new members of the committee as well. For the record, my name is Mark Hoffman. I'm the Maryland director for the Chesapeake Bay Commission. I'll, in a second, let you know what the commission does. But first, I'd like to introduce our new executive director, Anna Kilias, and Anna will have a few comments at the conclusion of my presentation. And just to be clear, I've been given 10 minutes to present 40 years of Chesapeake Bay restoration, history, progress, and challenges. So it's going to be pretty fast, and there'll be time for questions, I'm sure, at the end. And you could, so we're going to get going. And also, I'd like to recognize Tanya used to work for me. I worked for DNR for 30 years, and she was very able in our finance division while I was there. So thank you, Tanya. And you can go on to the next slide, please. First, just a word about the commission for those of you who are unfamiliar with it. It is sometimes confused with our last speaker today, but it is a legislative commission. It has 21 members, 15 of whom were state legislators and it's each state, Maryland, Virginia, and Pennsylvania represented. Back 42 years ago, when the efforts to restore the Bay started, there was a recognition that the state general assemblies would be a foundational partner in this effort. And you all have certainly proved to be such in the ensuing 42 years. Part of our job, my job, is to help you translate science, the science of the Bay restoration effort, into sound public policy. I'd like to recognize in particular our Senate members on the commission. Senator Gazzoni and Senator Elfreth are on the commission, and on the House side, our current delegation chair is Delegate Sarah Love. The vice chair is Delegate Dana Stein, and Delegate Tony Bridges completes the 5 members. Next. And it's important, you all obviously are very familiar with the Chesapeake Bay, but it really, I think this map is important in kind of understanding and getting your heads around the scale and the size of the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And quite frankly, what a small part of Maryland, from a land perspective, is part of the watershed, and it really extends beyond our borders, as we all know, into Pennsylvania, into New York, Virginia, West Virginia, Delaware. And that's part of the job of the commission, is to help coordinate legislative policy across the major states to achieve better outcomes for our citizens. The other thing I'd like to note here is there are 1,850 local governments in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And many of you have backgrounds in local government, and you can understand the added complexity and challenges that having that many local government brings to bear. And just briefly, if you look in the map here, that northern tier of Pennsylvania, I'm sure it's not surprising that water quality within the main stem of the Chesapeake is not that relevant, or certainly less relevant to someone living up there than it is to someone living in Annapolis. But that said, a commission member who also happens to be the Senate chair of their Natural Resources Committee was instrumental last year in passing legislation in Pennsylvania to create a new $300 million fund for agricultural water quality improvements. So they do hear us, and there is a great concern within the Commonwealth related to the water quality in their state and in Maryland as well. And and I don't want to sound trite, but it's important to remember we're not cleaning up the Chesapeake Bay watershed to make us feel good. It's a vital economic engine for our citizens and the economies of the state and the quality of life that our citizens enjoy. They're real tangible benefits to improving water quality in our living resources. A study conducted by the Bay Foundation showed that if we reached our clean water goals, the economic value of the Bay would increase by $22 billion annually, with $4.5 billion of that value accruing to the state of Maryland. 80% of our citizens rely on surface water for drinking and bathing. Few states in the nation are as defined by water as Maryland is. These illustrations pretty say it all, and I'd like to just do a quick, I've lived in Maryland all my life, and I think the words from Captain John Smith while he explored the Chesapeake in 1608 ring as true today as they did then. Heaven and earth never agreed better to frame a place for man's habitation. It's our job. We collectively obviously have a moral obligation to our children and future generations to work and to improve the Bay. And if there's one thing I could hope you remember today or leave from these briefings is just how shallow the Bay is. You can't tell that when you drive across the Bay Bridge. It looks all looks the same. But all those ships, those ships are all out in the middle in the channel, in the old in what was, of course, the Susquehanna River. 75% of the Bay is less than 10 feet deep. And this is the reason the Bay is so productive. Light can penetrate through the water, and you can get these luxuriant beds of seagrass, which support the crabs and all the other living resources. But at the same time, the shallowness of the Bay is its Achilles heel. So the volume of water is actually very small compared to the mass of land that drains into the watershed. So you have all the huge area of land and all the attendant pollution draining into a relatively small volume of water. That's one of the key challenges for Bay restoration. Science has told us, so the Bay is impaired. Based on the standards of the Federal Clean Water Act, the illustration on the right shows the currently impaired, as of 2010, the impaired waterways. And so we have, the essence of the issue is there's just too much nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment coming off the landscape into the Bay. This feeds phytoplankton, which then die. They rob the water of oxygen. You cannot have life without oxygen. And I love that old, very historic illustration from 1588, if you can believe it. And I love in the bottom right-hand corner, there's an Atlantic sturgeon, now endangered species, but was once a central species in the economy and the lifeblood of people that first settled this region. Science has told us just how clean we need to clean the Bay, how clean we need to get the Bay. The numbers, there's a lot of numbers, statistics, et cetera, but they're objectively scientific based. It's very important to remember that from the beginning of this effort, science has driven the restoration. We know how much oxygen various species need to live and reproduce, and our goals are to provide enough oxygen and get the water clean enough to allow those species. And also for people, the Clean Water Act standard is swimmable and fishable. We want to have a bay where it's safe to go out and put your toe and the rest of you in the water. The sources of pollution to the Bay are diverse. On the upper right-hand corner, agriculture, 41%, stormwater, 17%, wastewater, 21%, septic, 6%, and natural. There is some nitrogen coming off of natural lands, 4%. And we're working very hard to control and manage all these sources. And I particularly want to make a comment about that 41% in ag. It's very unfortunate. Often in these kinds of conversations, agriculture comes off as sort of a bad guy. And that's nothing could be further from the truth. Maryland farmers are some of the most progressive, conservation-oriented people in the nation. It's just by its very nature, agriculture is leaky. A farmer would much rather have every gram of nitrogen they put on the land go into the crop production. Anything that runs off is lost profit, but that's just not how nature works. So it's not, we just need to be very cognizant of that when we talk about ag and the bay restoration effort. How this is just a schematic of how the efforts to restore the bay are organized. All the 7 bay states are at the table, the District of Columbia. The Commission is a member representing the legislatures of the 3 states, and EPA is the lead federal agency. And the Executive Council meets annually. Those are the governors of all 3 states. Governor Moore will be on the Executive Council, and they work from the top to establish broad policy for bay. And then there's simply one of the things that's really changed if you go back 40 years, there are now thousands of people that come to work every day thinking about what they can do and how they can achieve better results for the bay and our local waterways. This is just a timeline. There have been, you hear a lot about all the various bay agreements. This goes back, actually, this year, 2023, is the 40th anniversary of the first bay agreement in 1983. The most recent was in 2014. What this, I hope you get out of this, is that it's a lesson of continued progress. Each of these agreements is built upon the last. We've become much more detailed and refined over time. The first bay agreement in 1983 was a one-page document that said we're going to work together and I guess hope things get better. Now we have a very rigorous methodology. We have numeric commitments from each of the jurisdictions, and we're working in a much more rigorous manner. And that's where you hear about the infamous TMDL. This is basically, we're not trying to get all the pollution out of the bay. We're just trying to get enough out so that the oxygen depredation doesn't happen and we can have sustained living resources. And that's what the TMDL, the total maximum daily load, that's the goal of the TMDL. And I just want to highlight a couple success stories. You know, there you read the papers, articles, there's a lot of negativity, often unfortunately associated with the restoration effort. It's not at all negative, and we need to be very clear about that. This is a graph showing the changes in wastewater treatment plant discharges in the Bay watershed. We achieved our goal in wastewater plant reductions 10 years ahead of schedule. Our 2025 goal was achieved in 2015. This is one of the key ways, based on largely on support action you took many years ago in passing the Bay Restoration Fund and creating the Bay Restoration Fund. Maryland is upgraded. It's almost completely finished upgrading its major wastewater treatment plants, and that's been a huge benefit in terms of reducing nutrient loads to the Bay, and the other jurisdictions have taken similar efforts. Another often overlooked pollutant in the Bay is from the air. The Bay's airshed is 570,000 square miles, 9 times larger than that of the watershed, and rainwater contains nitrogen and adds to our pollutant challenges. Between 1985 and 2015, loads of nitrogen from the atmospheric deposition declined by 60% due to implementation of the Federal Clean Air Act. So this has been another major driver in our success. So Bay water quality is improving. Nitrogen, phosphorus, sediment, they're all going down. They're not going down as fast as we planned. I don't think they're going down as fast as we want. But the fact of the matter is they're on the right trajectory, in spite of the fact that the population in the Bay watershed has doubled since the first beginning of the restoration efforts. And with each of us, we all obviously, each person has an attendant puts another attendant load on the environment and on new pollution discharge. To date, about 60% of our reductions have come from wastewater, 40% from the ag sector. We're still challenged to make progress in urban stormwater. Moving forward, since we pretty much reached the maximum we can do on the wastewater side, we need to continue to focus on ag BMPs and ag reductions and work to better on urban stormwater and continue to keep all jurisdictions accountable. We still do have a lot to do. Thank you. And I just wanted to highlight one thing. There's been a number of legislative proposals related to forest conservation over the decades. This is just a very telling graphic. So if you have an inch of rain from an acre of forest, you have 750 gallons of runoff. From an acre of impervious surface, you have 27,000 gallons of runoff. I think that really hopefully it helps inform discussion related to forest conservation and how important forests are to helping achieve our goals. I could spend a long time, and I know you're happy I won't, a long time talking about the legislative that's been passed over the decades. Trust me, you all have done a lot of heavy lifting related to legislative initiatives. I don't think 42 years ago when the commission was first started, it could have been imagined the success that each of the states would have been able to achieve on the legislative front. So we just thank you as a staff person, someone who lives in the watershed. You all have really done remarkable work over the many years. There's still challenges ahead, and I don't want to pat you on the back too hardly, but you all have done great work. And just briefly, the things the commission and our members are focused on, we continue to focus on ag. We're really concerned that we have the people to work with the ag community to implement the BMPs. There's a tremendous amount. The Inflation Reduction Act has $20 billion of new funding for NRCS. That's a nationwide number to implement additional BMPs. Maryland will get a big chunk of that. Forest and land conservation are priorities. The commission continues to work very hard on Capitol Hill to bring additional federal dollars to Maryland. And the Executive Council, within the last 2 years, passed new directives, one related to climate change, one related to DEIJ. I mean, I think it goes without saying that the benefits of the restoration effort have not accrued equally to all of our communities. And I think that's something that the partnership is now taking and addressing very seriously. And we're planning for the post-2025. That was the original goal for the TMDL. Maryland the reps will be up here as far as whether how Maryland's doing, but from a watershed perspective, we are not going to meet our 2025 goals, but the clock does not stop then. We continue, we keep persevering. And with that, I'm done with my comments, and Anna, if you want to.
Okay, Ms. Killius, why don't you,
thanks.
Why don't you?
Thank you.
It's all yours.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I will be brief because you have many experts to hear from. My name is Anna Killius. I am the new Executive Director for the Chesapeake Bay Commission. Just before this, I was in Richmond, Virginia, where I served as the Director of Advocacy for the James River Association, a conservation organization down there. And previous to that, I served as a legislative aide for Congressman Sarbanes in his D.C. office. I'm very excited to be here, to be working with the Maryland Commission members, and to work with you all on policies that will support Bay restoration in the future. So thank you very much for having us. Look forward to working with you.
Okay, let's open up some Q&A. We're going to start with Senator Hester, and then we'll go to Senator Lewis-Young.
Thank you very much for being here. It's great to see you again. I really appreciated what you said about agriculture. And with that 41%, I was curious if it differs, if there's any way to differentiate how much of that is coming from Maryland farmers versus Pennsylvania farmers versus any other farmers.
That's a watershed-wide, Senator, that's a watershed-wide number. I'd have to get back to you. Clearly, Maryland is less ag-intensive than some of those other jurisdictions, but I don't know that off the top of my head, but I'll have to get back to you.
If you could get back to us, that would be great, because we'd like to be as helpful as possible. But I appreciated what you said, because oftentimes Maryland farmers are blamed for things, and we're doing better than some of the other states are.
Indeed.
Thank you so much.
Okay, Senator Lewis Young.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the presentation. You had a chart that listed several of the drivers of pollution. If you were to do a regression analysis on those drivers, what would surface as the number one driver of our continuing challenge?
Well, I mean, currently, the one of the main, as I said, I talked about ag, that one of the main focus, part of the reason for the focus on ag is it's the most cost-effective place where we can implement best management practices and have positive results. So that is sort of the top, and we've done, initially it was the wastewater treatment plants, but we've pretty much done everything that we can do there. So we've moved, we're kind of trying to do this the most cost, dollars are limited. We're trying to do this in the most cost-effective manner. So ag is the main thing we're currently working on. That said, every sector this is a full-on game. It's not like we're ignoring anything. Urban stormwater is a challenge. If we have older communities, it's very expensive and challenging to address urban stormwater issues. We can do that on new development, but on older areas, the retrofitting old areas is extremely expensive. Thank you.
Okay, Senator Brooks.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Mr. Hoffman, for the presentation. And you mentioned the three B pollutants. That's the nitrogen, phosphorus, and the sediment. And some way I read that airborne nitrogen is a major contributor to the damage that's been happening in the Chesapeake Bay. Could you speak to that as well?
Yeah. I had a graphic on that. So that's correct, but it's due to the Clean Air Act and the implementation, particularly in the Midwest, of pollution control devices on energy generation facilities and industrial facilities in Ohio and in that area, because that air ends up over here. We've seen a huge reduction in air nitrogen deposition due to cleaning up power plants and industrial facilities in the Midwest. So it's not like there isn't any, but it's been a success story in those reductions.
Yeah, because I used to be under the impression that it was the runoffs from farms and whatnot that created the major pollution.
Well, it's not a major. I mean, it's a lesser. It's relatively small now compared to what it was in the past. You're welcome. Yes, sir.
Okay, any additional questions for this panel? We've got a total of 3 panels. Okay, well, thank you both for coming. With that, we're going to move. Did you have a? Oh, okay. Senator Gallion, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a few introductions. This morning, Senator Jennings welcomed some members of the LEAD Maryland class, and I had the opportunity to spend some time with 3 of them today who are shadowing me. Guests, I'd like to introduce them. First, Jen Wilson from Harford County Planning and Zoning. She's the Agricultural Preservation Program Planner there. We also have Chris Brown, who's from Cecil Soil Conservation District. He's the district manager. And Thomas Bagamza, who is from the Maryland Department of Agriculture. He manages the MAX program, which stands for Maryland Ag Cost Share. I knew you were going to ask about the acronym. And he's also my neighbor there in Harford County. So I'd just like to welcome, the LEAD program is a wonderful program. I think, were you the 12th class? 12th class. So Senator Jennings was in the 4th class, I believe. So if we could just give them a nice warm welcome here in the committee.
Okay, well, welcome to all 3 of you. And so we're next going to go to, we have a, yes, Senator Brooks.
Thanks, Chair. And I also have a shadow.
Absolutely, go on.
From one of my constituents from my district, District 10. And Stacy, would you stand, please? Stacy, I don't want to butcher your last name, so okay, okay. And thank. Would you?
Welcome, Stacy. Give her a welcome. Any other introductions before I go to panel 2? Okay. So we've got a state agency panel. Now I've got a list of 6 folks, but only 4 seats. So I think what we'll do is I'll call up four, I don't know if all six are speaking, but we've got Serena Coleman McIlwen, who's our designate secretary for the Maryland Department of the Environment. Serena, why don't you're going to be out front, number one spot. Lee Curry, Director, Water and Science Administration within the Maryland Department of the Environment. We've got Kevin Addix, Secretary Designee of our Maryland Department of Agriculture. Hans Schmidt, Assistant Secretary from our Department of Agriculture. And then when we go through this, after that, we'll call up Josh Kurtz, who's our DNR Secretary Designee. And finally, it'll be Dave Goshorn, Acting Assistant Secretary for Aquatic Resources at DNR. But I don't know if you have a sequence that you've already decided, or do you want me to pick who goes first? Madam Secretary Designee for MDE, why don't you lead off as, again, our lead witness?
Be happy to. Good afternoon, Chair Feldman and Vice Chair Kagan, and all the members of the Education, Energy, and Environment Committee. My name is Serena McIlwain. I am the Secretary Designee for the Maryland Department of the Environment. It's good seeing you all today, and I'm very happy to talk about the Chesapeake Bay restoration and everything that we're doing. So we'll get started. Okay, we can start with the first slide. So basically, there are three parts to our framework. We have the TMDL, which is a major piece of what we're, in terms of the Chesapeake Bay framework. We have the Chesapeake Bay Agreement, and we have the Chesapeake Bay Cabinet, which are my colleagues on the left of me. So that makes up the framework, the accountability framework. Next slide, please. In simple terms, you can see here that we're doing well. We're continuing to, as you see, those numbers are going down in terms of nitrogen pollution reductions. We do have a little hiccup where you see it goes up on the blue, and that's the wastewater treatment plant issue that we had. But as you can see, we're getting back on track. And if you see the red on there, that red really signifies that we're back to where we need to be, and we anticipate us getting back to our 2025 goals. And just so that you know, that reduction, that hiccup that I call that we had with the wastewater treatment plants, it was about an 18% get us off of track kind of number. But again, good news, we're back on track. Next slide, please. On this one, it just shows on the left that you can see where the pollution is coming from. Basically, it's the agricultural areas as well as urban communities. On the right side, you can see the main area for which these reductions are really coming from. It's a little more clear here. So you have agriculture and you have the wastewater. But I will say stormwater, even though it says 1%, it's really critical. That's a very important area that we're focusing on as well. Next slide, please. The investments are, no, I think, yeah, okay. On this slide, we're demonstrating that the investments are making a difference. You can see again the line, the line is improving in both areas, nitrogen and phosphorus. And that's basically what we wanted to show here. Next slide, please. So in terms of the priorities of the Chesapeake Bay restoration, the priorities are wastewater, stormwater, and obviously Conowingo Dam. That's really critical right now. And I just want to say from my perspective coming into this role, environmental justice is critical in all areas. And we're making sure that we have an equity lens on everything that we do. And so everything here you're seeing will have an environmental justice component as well as climate resiliency component. Next slide, please. And these are, I don't know if you can see that, it's kind of small. So this is, if you see the first, is that the right slide?
Yeah, they put it into 2 slides on yours.
Oh, that's why I
Yeah,
can't
it's
see
It's
it.
an older slide deck.
Okay. I hope you can see this. I'll try to tell you what it says. The first piece of it, the Bay Restoration Fund, we've been able to collect about $1.9 billion. And what you see on those bullets under, the first set is where those funds came from, where we were collecting funds. And it's the Maryland Department of Environment, the wastewater treatment fund. We have the septic funds, and we also have the cover crop program. So that's where the funds are coming in. The other pieces to it is we're basically just showing where we are actually investing those funds. And one highlight I will say is we've invested in 67 wastewater treatment plants, the major ones, and 35 of the smaller ones. That's basically what we're saying here. Next, yeah, let's just go to the next slide, please. And on here, we're just showing more money in terms of where we can invest in water infrastructure. We plan, if you see the blue on that chart, that's from, we have an EJ screening tool. And the colors that you're seeing on this, like the blues and the greens, those are the communities, the EJ communities that we want to ensure that we're investing the money in. So that's why I'm showing you this chart. So more to come on that, more investments, but again, we're looking at everything from an EJ perspective. Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague. Which one of you would like to go? All right.
Hey, Mr. Addicks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, Madam Vice Chair, and members of the committee. Thank you for welcoming us and the Department of Agriculture specifically to present. We've got incredible stories to tell about what agriculture is doing in Maryland to help protect the Bay. A good question was raised about non-Maryland ag, and that's a concern. We can control agriculture and inputs coming from agriculture in Maryland. We cannot, for better or worse, control the practices in other states. So we'll talk a little bit about our practices. Able to go to the next slide, please?
Before we go any further, I may have missed Senator Augustine, may have had his light on, and I rushed to Secretary Addicks. So if we might indulge, Senator
you.
Augustine, I
Yeah.
apologize.
This is
Sorry.
new territory, so forgive me. First of all, I think I looked it up, total maximum daily load, is that TMDL?
Yes.
Because I don't know what that
I'm
is.
sorry.
Yeah,
Yes.
So that's just, we'll start with that, okay. And then the water quality revenue fund, how much is that? How big is it?
The total fund?
Yes.
So there's the 2 funds, there's the
And then
Bay
the-
Restoration Fund, and are you talking about?
Yeah, you
the
got to
state
go,
revolving?
if you get close to the mic, because
Sorry, and
we're
for the-
streaming.
For the record, Lee Curry, Director of Water and Science Administration, Maryland Department of the Environment. Are you talking about the state revolving fund?
Correct, that's what I was just looking at the
Yes.
slide, and I was just trying to understand kind of like what that was, where it came from, and what's the scope of it.
Sure. The state revolving fund is actually money that's provided by EPA. It goes into low-interest loans. And
Okay.
I don't recall the exact number in terms of how much is in there, but there's been a significant increase in that fund that is a result of the federal infrastructure dollars from the bipartisan infrastructure law. So what we're saying right now is there's not only the base money that we had before, which was, again, I don't want to give the number, but I think it was in the 25 to 50 million or probably more range per year, that's being added to right now.
Okay.
And when it's added to, it creates more opportunities for low-interest rate loans. But the other part of the federal infrastructure funding is that there is a 49% loan forgiveness,
Okay.
and that's especially targeted towards EJ communities. So we, as the Secretary was mentioning, this is a great opportunity for us to target that funding. We've also just completed at the end of January, I think it was the first solicitation for projects that would fall under that fund, so we're in the process of reviewing those projects right now. And that fund extends beyond just the water quality benefits, it extends into drinking water also.
Okay, just one real last one. And is this is there like a state match to this, or is there not a state match to this? Can you just help me, I'm just trying to understand.
Yes, sir. There is a state match, and the department puts up that match for these funds. I believe,
EPA gives more.
do you know what it is? I believe it's about 10 or 20%, but I can get you that exact number from our water. We have a Water Quality Finance Administration that oversees that, so we can follow up with those questions, and I can get you the more specifics. You're welcome.
Okay, before we go back to Secretary Addicks, Vice Chair Kagan had a question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I just want, for folks who are watching here or watching online, and for colleagues, Secretary Addicks and Secretary Kurtz are pretty well known to us and to Maryland, but Secretary Coleman McIlwain is less known to us, and I have known you by reputation, and the rumors about bringing you to Maryland were very exciting, and so I just want to congratulate you, but I also just want to give a couple of credentials, because that was not given in her brief introduction. She was the Undersecretary and Chief Operations Officer in California, which is what I knew about, but she also worked at the United States, at the U.S. EPA. I just touched something on my screen that made your bio go away. Chief Performance Officer, Improvement Officer, Chief Operating Officer, Assistant Regional Administrator, worked as the COO, the Office of Fossil Energy at the U.S. Department of Energy, was educated at George Mason, where she got her master's in public administration, went to Central Michigan University, Strayer University, and others. And so I just wanted to officially, on behalf, I'm sure I can speak on behalf of my colleagues, to say how delighted we are to have you join us to add to the wealth of experience and expertise that we have working on our issues affecting the Chesapeake Bay. And so congratulations.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for coming to Maryland.
Thank you, thank you. I really appreciate that.
Thank you,
Okay,
Mr.
well,
Chair.
thank you, and thank you, Madam Vice Chair, for doing that. And so with that said, let's go back to Secretary Addicks. Secretary Designee Addicks.
Secretary Designee,
You
thank
all
you.
still have to get through the executive nominations
let's not rush
process
things.
and the full state senate.
And I would like to add to what the Vice Chair said, and may I speak for you for a moment? We're honored to be sharing the table with a rock star. So, with that, let's talk briefly about agriculture. First of all, farmers were the original conservationists. Farmers were the original environmentalists. Nothing matters more to the farmer than the health of the environment, the health of the soil. And so the programs that we're going to be speaking about over the next 3 slides are all about keeping farming productive and profitable, of course, but also about protecting the bay. And those two go directly together hand in hand. So the first part is about supporting the farmer. So we have 24 soil conservation districts around the state. And included in those, there are 53 staffers. 44 of those positions are full, and the rest we're working on filling. And those staffers are, in addition to other state and federal supports, to work with farmers to make sure that they're doing what they need to do to protect the bay. And in doing so, we're creating creative policies to help them be more profitable while they do it. So we're doing our best to expand our reach. We are increasingly developing new programs to leverage co-benefits beyond nutrient reductions, healthy soils, mitigating climate change, equitable programs, trying to leverage federal money, trying to also work with our neighbors, as I said, to influence what's happening to the north. Next slide, please. Nutrient management is a huge, huge part of what we do, and that is to make sure that the ag community is doing the right thing, but also it's part of our job to make sure that they're getting credit for doing the right thing, because some of these practices are not easy, and especially when you look above the border and see that all you have to do is take a rural road in Harford County or Carroll County and dip into Pennsylvania, and you can visually see how different the practices are. Their animals are in the streams. Ours are not. Simple thing like that makes a big, big difference in our numbers when we're talking about the bay. To make sure that our farmers are continuing to do the right thing, we do have a 6-member field assessment team that re-verifies the presence of these conservation programs and practices that our farmers may have received money to implement. And what we've found through these nearly 20,000 practice audits is that 70%, after the program ends, after their involvement in the program ends, 70% are still keeping up with those practices. So it proves that they have found benefit in those practices as well, and they're just, our farmers are good stewards. Next slide, please. Finally, as we draw toward 2025, and as we are working with our federal partners on the new Farm Bill, which is a every 5-year, very comprehensive look at programs, we're working with our federal partners to make sure they're incentivizing what we think are the right things and pulling a little bit of money away from some things that might not be in the best interest of our farmers here in Maryland. Agriculture looks very different in Maryland than it does in the Midwest or the upper Midwest or beyond. And so we're trying to focus our energies. The big take-home message is that Maryland farmers are extremely committed to bay restoration. You saw the numbers, reaching those goals. It's totally doable and within the realm of possibility, and it's through staffing the agency, revising our programs to make sure that we're aiming in the right direction to protect the bay, which means jobs and the fisheries and sporting and everything else. We owe that to the bay, we owe that to Maryland, and Maryland agriculture is committed to it and is a partner. So I look forward to working with our peer agencies and answering any of your questions. Thank you.
Okay, any questions for Secretary-Designee Addicks? Okay, seeing none, we're going to go to Secretary-Designee Kurtz, DNR.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Mr. Chair, Madam Vice Chair, members of the committee for having me today. You can go to the next slide, please. As you've heard from my colleagues, there's a big focus on the major sectors of pollution. Part of the Bay Agreement actually has 31 outcomes. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the other 28 that impact our water quality in a positive way, but also provide a whole bunch of other co-benefits to our communities and that we all care about. I wanted to start first also with orienting us to the science behind this. So we do manage water quality monitoring stations all across the state of Maryland. What you see here, the bigger green dots are ones where our water quality has improved since 1983, where we have these sites. The smaller dots are, I'm sure very hard to see, I apologize, are where it stayed the same. So about 60% has improved, 35% has stayed the same, about 5% has actually gotten worse. And that's really important for us so we can make management decisions and focus in on the areas that need the most help, also so we can learn from the places that we've been most successful. Next slide, please. One of the places where we deliver the most programs, and I think programs that are the most effective, is through the Chesapeake and Atlantic Coastal Bays Trust Fund of 2010. This is called the 2010 Trust Fund by a lot of people. And this fund is really important because it's highly leverageable. So these are funds that go out through grants. They can match federal dollars, local dollars, and they go to community groups, nonprofits, local governments to be able to implement practices that clean the water and really help us with some of these non-point source pollutions like urban stormwater runoff and agriculture. The great thing about these projects, though, is that we can really work with local governments and people on the ground and figure out what are the additional things that these communities want and need. Is it flooding reduction? Is it access to green space? What economic drivers are important that we can help improve through making these investments in water quality and these practices, and then also helping with kind of local economic development and other general improvements in quality of life. Next slide, please. One thing that we're doing at the department is really taking that entire government approach. It's so important for us to be able to take into consideration water quality as a whole as we look across the bay, but also think about what we're doing and how that impacts either local water quality. And so some of the ways we are doing that is by working with our federal partners, local partners, to pair funding sources. So one thing we hear from NGOs often is that it's really difficult to access these grant funds, really a lot of paperwork. But what the department's able to do is package them and make that a little bit easier, streamline some of that so we can get these funds across our communities to improve the water quality, build climate resilience, and tackle some of our environmental justice issues. Next slide, please. Great thing about these natural infrastructure projects, we call them win-wins, is a lot of them also can be used for adaptation to climate change and also to mitigating climate change. So trees pull carbon out of the air, they sequester that carbon. It's good for climate, it's also good for clean water. Practices like living shorelines, they reduce erosion, make our communities more resilient in the face of climate change. So a wide range of different ways that we're trying to, again, pair funding that we can be using for these climate outcomes with water quality outcomes as well. And the department does chair the Adaptation and Resilience Working Group on the Maryland Commission on Climate Change. So again, another forum where we're able to work with many stakeholders to identify practices that are going to build resilience in our communities while also cleaning up the water. Next slide, please. So I want to focus on one specific intervention and a thank you to this body for some of the tools that you've given to the department recently. The 5 Million Trees program is up and running and underway. Several partners involved in that, the Department of Environment, Department of Agriculture, all of us at this table, the Chesapeake Bay Trust, to deliver these projects into communities and onto farms and into our suburbs. So really excited about this. Just got rolling. The Chesapeake Bay Trust program was actually oversubscribed, which means more people wanted trees than we could actually give them, which is, I think, a really good, strong place for us to be, especially with a new program. Next slide, please. Land preservation, I think, is something that is not often thought about, but I thought Mark Hoffman's slide really illustrated the importance of. If we can protect some of these really critically important habitats, we can keep that pollution from running off by, stopping and slowing development in places. The way that we look at our projects for land preservation, we have a scoring sheet, so we're looking at the impacts to water quality, but we're also looking at human impacts. How is this creating equitable access to green spaces? How is this preserving our cultural resources? How is this impacting our economic species? So it allows us to really focus in and, again, spend the funds as wisely as possible. Next slide, please. A lot of what we do with clean water is really important for habitat and for our fisheries. And one of the important pieces within our water that helps us get clean water is our oysters and our mussels. So these are bivalves that pull nutrients out of the water, very important for our clean water. As part of the Bay Agreement, we agreed to do 5 large-scale restoration projects. 4 of those have been initially restored, and the 5th is underway right now. Mussels is a newer space for us, but we're constructing a new hatchery, and we're going to be able to deliver mussels all across our freshwater tributaries. Next slide, please. And then fisheries, we need clean water so that we can have our sustainable fisheries, an incredibly important economic driver. You look at blue crabs and striped bass, our numbers have been waffling. And I really wanted to put in the bottom here the invasive species piece, because I think it's critically important to understand that, we talked a little bit about what are some of the new challenges, right? It's climate change, but it's also invasive species. And blue crabs and striped bass are particularly susceptible to the blue catfish, and that's something that our department is going to be prioritizing as we move forward before this gets completely out of control, although in some watersheds it is a major problem right now. Next slide, please. So this is a little bit of a synopsis for all of us here, but we wanted to point to some of the opportunities that we see moving forward. Obviously, federal infrastructure funding, there's substantial money that can go to many of the programs that our agencies oversee. Continuing to work on Conowingo, the BMPs that are going to help us offset some of those pollution loads. Accounting for co-benefits. You've heard a lot about the things that we can do other than water quality with these programs, making sure we're maximizing that. Being really innovative with the funding, the Conservation Finance Act is allowing us to tap into private markets to get outcomes that are really good for clean water, and we're going to continue to grow that. And then obviously looking at both water quality and economic benefits from large-scale restoration, as well as opportunities in places like the aquaculture industry. Next slide, please. And then I guess we'll leave you on a little bit of the downer note here, but some of the challenges that we see that are substantial, obviously climate change, Conowingo growth, we've talked about that a lot, state workforce, and being able to have a team of people that are implementing these projects successfully across the state. Making sure that other jurisdictions are accounting for their restoration goals and being held accountable. We've heard a lot about Pennsylvania today. And then also looking at that water quality network that I brought up earlier. There are opportunities for us to get federal funds to make that water quality monitoring network far more, one, to have more monitoring networks and make sure that we're able to do the back end work of really understanding what's contributing to either the successes or the failures. As well as really building in new science. We're seeing this all the time. The Harry Hughes Center study, brand new data that is able to look at forests and tree canopy on a very fine scale, an incredibly important tool. But kind of across the board, we're seeing this increase in the sciences from our educational institutions, NGO communities, and I think something that, while it's a challenge, it's also an opportunity. So I think that's all for me today. Thank you very much.
Okay, we're going to go to some questions. Let's start with Senator Carrozza, and then we'll go Senator Washington, then to the other side, Senator Gallion. Senator Carrozza.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank all the panel and the secretary designees, and I also wanted to compliment all three of you for making the extra effort to meet with us beforehand. And my couple questions directed to Secretary Designee Kurtz. Thank you for the call, the Zoom that we had earlier. I really thought we were able to get into some detail on some of these priorities. I wanted to ask you, kind of hone in a little bit on your comment about partnerships when we work on some of our goals when it comes to water quality. And the two partners I wanted to zero in on, which will not surprise you, would be when you mentioned the, oyster restoration, the role of our commercial watermen and what they bring to the table with their expertise. And then two, I'm always reminding my colleagues that it's Chesapeake and Atlantic coastal bays, and you wanted to talk a little bit about your partnership with the Maryland coastal bays. You mentioned the living shoreline. So if you could just expand a little bit more on those two partners.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for the question. When we look at especially the oyster space, we kind of evaluate that as, we call it a stool at the department. So we have the public fishery areas, which is where our watermen work. We also have the restoration areas, which we talked about here, and then aquaculture. So having all three of those and managing all three of those in the way that we're continuing to grow the resource, being able to learn from each other, right? I think we hear from our watermen some really specific details on local water bodies, what's working, what's not, and continuing to partner. I think one really exciting thing that we're working on at the department is the Eastern Bay Project, which actually marries all of those together. So instead of thinking about things in silos, we're working in partnership with our research academies, the NGOs, the watermen, to make sure that we're having really successful restoration that allows for us to grow the economic return of the oyster, as well as the clean water benefits as well. So was there anything more specific you wanted me to touch on there? Or?
Just maybe the opportunities for the watermen to continue to share, their, what their findings day in and day out, and to just a comment on the Maryland coastal bays.
Yes. So no, absolutely, and I think one thing we're working on, and I have an incredible staff that works with watermen every day, and hear from them. I think, we talked about the water quality monitoring, but we also learn from people that have those day-to-day interactions with the resource, and I think that's a space where continuing to partner and bring in everybody's perspective is going to be important moving forward. The coastal bays, obviously critically important habitats. They provide ecotourism, they clean the water, and we do target when we're doing our targeting, we're looking at those coastal bay ecosystems as well, and making sure that when we're distributing resources, we're thinking about not just the bay, but some of these more specific areas. We do that in other places too, when we have kind of like local water quality challenges, but the coastal bays are critically important habitats that we also are putting a finer point on as well through many of these programs. Yeah.
We'll go to Senator Washington, then Senator Gallion, and then back to Senator Hester.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of the designees, and looking forward to continuing this conversation with each of you individually. There's so much to ask you, and again, we're just very excited. I'm personally very excited to be able to partner. So I am going to ask everyone sort of a big question, but I'm wondering in particular, some of you sort of mentioned it lightly, others didn't at all, but each of your agencies, you're talking about the capacity to fulfill the mission of the agency and to fulfill the goal or the historic role that Maryland has had as being a leader in each of your sectors, which has declined a bit. In terms of your workforce, so for example, you say here the state workforce capacity to manage the efforts and support implementers. Okay. What is the state of each of your agencies? So I would say each of you. How many vacancies do you have? And what are you looking for, and what do each of you need to get to to get fully staffed with your existing PINs? Yeah.
Thank you for asking that, because it is important and it's a priority. For MDE, we have about 880, I call them FTEs where I'm from, but it's PINs here. We have a vacancy rate of about 16%. So we have to backfill about 160 positions. And the way we're going to do it is because of, thank you for mentioning my background, one strength of mine is cleaning up processes and being efficient and taking non-value steps out of processes. And that is one of the first conversations I had with my leaders, which is, okay, we need to do everything we can to get people in seats. And if that means we have to work with personnel or whoever, we need to do it. So that's a directive that we have to make sure we have a recruitment strategy that's sound, that we can get people in quickly, that we can look at pay, look at equity, look across the board, and the governor said this yesterday, at some of those positions where we may not need certain educations, where we're not able to bring people on board. So we're looking at that too. It's a priority. I'm pushing it. In reality, we can get, like I've said, I want it down to 0. Now, I know that's unrealistic because you have people leaving. You have people retiring. And we hire from within. So that creates another vacancy, right? But we have to have a system in place where the vacancy rate is low. Because to be quite honest with you, in order to do what we have to do for climate goals and everything that we're talking about today, we're going to need more positions too. We have a big lift. We have a lot to do. And so I hope to demonstrate from my leadership that we can backfill those positions and get the positions filled. Thank you.
Same question?
Yep,
Yes.
same question.
So yes, we're about 13% vacancies. When we look across the agency, I think we're going to need kind of varied recruiting strategies. We have a wide range of different types of folks and different types of roles across the department, right? So what might work for the Natural Resources Police might look very differently for our fishing and boating services, might look very different for our wildlife service, and the forestry folks. So what we're working to do with the leaders of those agencies is identify what are the critical jobs we need filled like now, right? Where are the things, I touched on blue catfish. We don't have invasive species staff that are specifically focused on the invasive species. So we need to make sure that we're orienting our hirings to where we have the most critical need to start, and thinking about different opportunities for recruiting strategies based on the job function and the department. So we've been working really closely with our unit directors to figure out how we do that, and we want to make sure that we're doing it as effectively as possible.
Sounds like the hiring and both from the MDE secretary, that it's being policy driven and being the focus is about achieving the goals. Next.
Thank you, Senator, for the question. So we have a little over 400 staffers at the Maryland Department of Agriculture, and we have roughly a 12% vacancy rate, which equates to about 40 positions that are open. And again, for all the same reasons, some are in transition. There are a bunch that are in the onboarding process but are not yet showing up on our roster. Of the 53 technical positions related specifically to Chesapeake Bay, I mentioned that we have 44 staffed, so we're 9 short on those. And again, we've had discussions about why we're having trouble, and I've been talking with, or not trouble, but it's a process, and trying to work, as you said, I need to bring you in to clean up our, potential. She's on loan to all agencies.
I'm expensive.
From this point on. Just, and having run a small business, I've had the same questions when I come in. What's the process? How long does it take? Does it really take that long to bring someone on? So we're working with DBM, who does, all of the hiring, just to try to roll these processes and make it more efficient. And then I'll be taking a look at the pins, and are there units and divisions that have extra pins? Probably not the case, but if there is the ability to shuffle and move around to where our priorities lay, then we'll be making those changes.
Okay, well, I think he's part of MDE, Mr. Curry. Yeah, he's under, yeah, so.
A final, why I asked that question, particularly for our committee, we are education, energy, and the environment, and we are have been very focused on apprenticeships, on making sure that our young people are career ready. And many of us do in fact believe, and it was intimated by our governor, that there is work to be done in our state, and then our children, our students can do that work. So as we build out our workforce development, our apprenticeship programs, our educational requirements and certifications that you think are needed, please stay in touch with that component of your work as well. There's the environmental part, but there's very much also the educational component that I know that this is a sector that pays living wages and has a healthy lifestyle associated with it. And the more of our Maryland young people and some of us older folks can get into this sector, the better for everyone. So we look forward to working with you in that space as well. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Absolutely. Senator Gallion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple questions. The first one, we've talked a good bit about Conowingo Dam. It's been referenced a couple times, and I appreciate the three designees coming and getting to meet with you personally a couple weeks ago. I just want to know kind of what's your thought or your plan for dealing with this. We have an issue with the sediment buildup behind the dam. We talked about the nutrients and stuff coming from Pennsylvania and New York. It's basically just going straight through. There's nothing to stop it until you do some sort of dredging and do something with that sediment that's accumulated behind the dam. Kind of what's your plan as far as working with our federal partners to try to address that issue of that sediment behind the dam?
I was about to answer until you said federal partners. So you're referring to Conowingo Dam and the issue. So we have an opportunity to, and I can't say much because we're in settlement with Conowingo Dam regarding the issues that you talked about. But they were given a license from FERC to operate for 50 years, and now that license has been vacated, which puts it back in the hands of MDE, us, to negotiate with them. And so we're going to take that opportunity to negotiate hard on implementing the water quality conditions that we had in the first place before we settled. So they're willing to work with us, and we're going to be working with them to deal with those issues. Again, I can't say much because we are in the middle of legal conversations about it.
Thank you for your willingness to work on that. Much appreciated, because it's going to take a group effort to get that done.
Yes.
Second question is for DNR designee. We talked a little bit about the 5 million trees being planted, and I had some concerns with that legislation originally, not so much as the trees, but the maintenance of. But so, I guess the first question is, what's your agency's priority to planting trees on state ag land?
State ag land. I might have to get back to you on exactly on ag land. I know we've got the retree program, and ones that we're focused on are, actually, hold on one second. Let me see if I could get some help from a friend real quick.
No. Well, we have a lot of leases, and we're trying to, we can do what we can to plant buffers.
Okay. So are you talking on protecting the leased land? Okay, yeah, so we could do buffers in working with the leaseholders of the land, but not a formal program to plan on those.
One last thing, I believe since it was kind of added into that legislation, a concern, we had some issues, especially in my district, where there have been tree plantings in the past, and they weren't properly maintained, and you basically have a weedy mess growing up and weed seed blowing all over the place, and some of it's adjoining ag ground. So just want to make sure we stay on top of that as far as, mowing at least twice a year or whatever. I forget what we put in the legislation, but, I mean, you can plant as many trees as you want, but if you don't, take care of them, it's just going to turn into a mess, so.
Yeah, and that point is well taken. I think we've seen both the good and the bad, right? Ones where they leave the tubes on, and I think the important thing about the legislation is one, having that requirement, and then as a department, we'll make sure that when projects are being applied for, that they have the capacity to be able to handle the maintenance on the back end.
Okay, before we go to Vice Chair Kagan, did Senator Hester, did you have a question? You earlier had your light on. Okay, we'll go to you, and then we'll go to Vice Chair Kagan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And thank you all for being here. So last year, this committee passed, and I believe the Senate passed almost unanimously, the bill to create a Chief Resilience Office and an officer for, and a Chief Resilience Officer and an Office of Resilience. And to my understanding, that person, is still one of the vacant pins, and the office is still not staffed. This bill, I think, is critical, and it's within the Maryland Department of Emergency Management because it has a coordinating approach. So each one of your agencies would work with this Chief Resilience Officer on things like coordinating state and local resilience, developing a state resilience strategy, providing that technical on-the-ground resilience to local communities, and in doing all this, prioritizing those vulnerable communities and using that environmental justice lens. And so I guess my question is, as you're hiring people, would you please also just think about this office and maybe in a supplemental budget or something? I'd really love to have that office staffed up.
Sure. Thank you.
Good and succinct
Absolutely.
answer. Vice Chair Kagan.
Chair, each of the three secretary nominees referenced EJ, environmental justice, and I wonder if each of you could speak not just in a hypothetical, but could you give an example? Because a lot of people talk about justice, and a lot of people, we've had a lot of bad things happen in vulnerable communities. So if you could give very specific examples or priorities about something your department would do to address environmental justice, that would be great. And I'm going to suggest we go in reverse order, starting with Secretary-designee Kurtz.
Great, yeah, thank you very much. And I actually just had a conversation about this with our land planning team before we came here, so I'm glad you asked me this question. So one of the things we're looking at when we're doing any of our easement purchases, our land acquisitions, and we've been working with the University of Maryland on this, we're going through, obviously, that checklist that I talked about, but we also have map layers that we're looking at so that we make sure that we're being proactive and trying to get to places where we have environmental justice concerns. So that is a really specific way we're trying to change how we operate, working with University of Maryland and other partners that can really help us identify places where we need to be working, where we've had underserved communities. So that's one specific.
So I did notice your map with the dots that you apologized for being too small. I'm wondering why it is you think the rest of the state sort of gets off the hook. Aren't there sort of challenges everywhere? Maybe some are more acute, or is that sort of how you prioritize and then you'll get around to others as well?
No, that is more of like a verifying system, right? So we're looking at many more things other than just those monitoring points when we're deciding on where we're going to work across the state. That's to help us kind of get that big picture validation for kind of the bay restoration work and also identify some of the more broad locations. But we do, work with people on the ground to identify very, hyper-local issues. So I wouldn't say that is the be-all, end-all of how we make our decisions. It's to help us with kind of connecting some of the broader picture.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. So one major focus of our agency is the promotion and development of urban agriculture. One of the core kind of tenets of that is very often these are communities that are in need of food. They're food insecure. And so if they are able to grow their own food, there's educational components as well, see how food is grown, be involved in how food is grown, then you are creating a culture of agriculture and of food production exactly where it's needed. And so we've had a lot of programs with that, we'll be focusing on that in the future. Baltimore City, of course, but many places around the state are in need of this type of very unique segment of agriculture.
Designate addicts.
Oh, thank you. So for me, it's a lot of ways. I'll try to keep the focus on Chesapeake Bay, but I just have to take this opportunity to say, in terms of EJ, we're also looking at, for me, a priority is where we're giving permits. And there's cumulative impacts in these disadvantaged communities that we talk about so often. And so one of the things I'm pushing hard is I'm working with US EPA to give us more cover, not just Maryland, but all states, so that we can look harder and make better decisions when we're giving permits, when we know that there is a cumulative impact. So that's one of the areas that I'm focused on. And we talked about the other area in terms of Chesapeake Bay restoration. We talked about the SRF funding earlier. So we're going to be prioritizing that funding in the EJ areas. That's a priority. We have some pilots going on now where we're funding in some of those areas. So that's going to be, I don't have a strategy to tell you about, to be honest. I'm not going to sit here and make up one for you, but I will tell you that that is the main priority for me, making sure that the funding, the money that we have is going to those communities for grants, for projects, for infrastructure building, all the above.
So thank you to each of you. I really look forward to really getting deliverables on this as part of the Leave No Marylander Behind.
Yes.
And make sure that everyone cares about the environment, everyone is protected by the environment, and we move forward. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, now, I don't know if Dave Goshorn or Hans Schmidt, are they just here for support, or were they planning to separately? Okay, fair enough. Any final questions for our panel of distinguished secretary designees? Okay, seeing none, well, thank you all for your testimony and presentation.
Thank you.
And then we have one final third panel of two people from the Chesapeake Bay Foundation to play cleanup here today. Eric Fisher, from Maryland Interim Executive Director of the Foundation, and Maryland Staff Attorney Matt Stegman. So if you two will come up, and you'll be our final panel for the briefing today. So Mr. Fisher, do you want to start as the Interim Executive Director? And then we'll go to Matt Stegman, and then we'll take questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Madam Vice Chair, members of the committee. It's good to see you all again this year. As mentioned, Eric Fisher, Interim Maryland Executive Director with CBF, here with our Staff Attorney and Legislative Lead, Matthew Stegman. Appreciate the opportunity to address this issue with the committee today. As Mr. Hoffman stated earlier, we know that this has been a priority for this committee for years, and we appreciate the work that you all have done and continue to do on the Chesapeake Bay. I want to be clear that we are one of hundreds of state, regional, and local nonprofit organizations working towards clean water, and we wish to carry forth their appreciation for your work and also the urgency that we all feel to get the job done. Next slide. Specifically, Chesapeake Bay Foundation, we are going on our 56th year. We are a nonprofit education and advocacy organization with operations from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, down to Virginia Beach, Virginia, with stops in Richmond and Washington, D.C. We have almost 200 staff spread across the watershed working on issues as varied as K-12 field education, oyster restoration, tree plantings and pasture conversion on farms, and policy and advocacy. So we are with oyster growers in the water, we are with farmers on pastures and farm fields, we are in classrooms, and we are here in the halls of Annapolis as a resource for you. Next slide. Question we often get first is, how is the Bay doing? And when we look at the markers of a healthy Chesapeake Bay system, we could be doing better. The truth is we're estimating at about a D+. It's one way to look at it. numerically, about a 32 out of 100. But I think it's important to evaluate these numbers in context. Next slide. So the solid line is where we've been as a community, and the dotted line is where we need to head. And I think there are two takeaways here. The first is that the line is moving in the right direction. This speaks to the fact that the science is clear about what needs to be done. And when we take those actions, when we make those investments, when we put sensible regulations and incentives in place, the Bay responds. We are healthier than we were in the past. These actions are working. The second takeaway is that we do have a ways to go. Next slide. We're approaching our 2025 deadline, and there's much discussion about where we go from here. Past investments in wastewater treatment, cover crops, nutrient management has gotten us a significant way forward. But we need to accelerate our work, and we need to make sure that the practices we're putting in the ground are sustainable over the long term. So we're looking, and we recommend, balancing out our restoration portfolio, looking for more cost-effective solutions. They do exist. Addressing climate change in terms of the cleanup, and also making sure that the cleanup is equitable and the benefits from the Chesapeake Bay cleanup benefit all communities. If this formula was a mathematical formula, we would say that the equals would be natural filters. Natural filters like wetlands, forest buffers, green stormwater infrastructure, pastures, they check all of these boxes. And you will be hearing from us and from others about how we feel the state can support the implementation of more of those natural filters on land and in the water. And with that, I will turn it over to Mr. Stegman, who will walk us through a little bit more.
Yeah, thank you. Can we get the next slide? Thank you. So just very briefly, some of the things that CBF is working on in coalition with some of those hundreds of other groups that Eric mentioned. First and foremost, we're looking at a overhaul of the state's forest conservation goals to make sure that we are clear about what we're trying to accomplish, that we are capitalizing on the opportunity to move Maryland to a place where we're not just preserving the forest we have, we're actually gaining forest cover and tree canopy. And the way that we're going to achieve that is by giving local governments the flexibility to get creative and figure out forest preservation strategies that also work with their county economic development strategies. Next slide. Living shorelines. We want to, make sure that where living shorelines are appropriate, that they are being installed. We want to take a look at reforming the waiver process to again make sure that where they are appropriate, they are being installed, and recognizing that sometimes when you're doing the right thing, there is an additional cost to that. That we are providing financial incentives to make sure that is something that's achievable for folks. Next slide. Oyster aquaculture. We have
Matt,
a couple.
I just had an inquiry about aging. What's
sure.
the term you threw through? Was a little unfamiliar. Go back one.
Yeah.
Yeah, what is that term? Aging armored shoreline. What does
Sure.
that mean?
So that would be just riprap and other types of armored shoreline that has been. Eric,
Yep, so a wall, whether it's wooden or stone, some kind of revetment, would be an example of an armored shoreline, or piled rock with no other natural features associated with it. Correct. Between the land and the water.
Yeah, yeah. Understood, and I
Well
apologize
taken.
for running through quickly. A lot of these are bills that will come before this committee, and we look forward to having
Okay, you can go back to the next
lengthier
slide. We're good.
discussions. Thanks. Oyster aquaculture. I think you heard both of the previous two panels about the ecological benefits of oysters. We want to make sure that in the places that are available for aquaculture, we're growing both the amount of area under cultivation and also the opportunities within the industry. Again, we have a couple bills that have been sponsored by Senator Klossmeyer that I think may end up in front of this committee. And then just, making the investments that make the goals for 2025 and beyond achievable. We were very pleased with some of the things that we saw in the governor's budget, including funding for the Bay Restoration Program, the Chesapeake and Atlantic Coastal Bay Trust Fund, Program Open Space, some of those preservation programs. The panel of secretaries touched on, but it's been a big issue for CBF. The giant backlog of stormwater permits. There were enhancements to make sure that those permits are written and enforced. And one thing that we're particularly excited about, based on legislation that the General Assembly passed last year, there was funding this year for a survey of the Chesapeake Bay bottom. It's been decades since since many places have been surveyed, and it'll be very helpful to know what's actually there under the water. So on that note, we look forward to be in front of this committee often this session, but we also want to make sure that we're available as a resource to you for anything that you are doing that touches on water quality, whether it be legislative, things in your district. We are a nonpartisan organization. We want to work with everybody who is interested in making our bay cleaner.
Any questions for our two panelists? Okay, thank you very much. I'm sorry, Senator Carrozza, you look like you're itching to touch your button, so yes or no?
It was after you were ready to wrap up, I had a point of personal privilege.
Okay, well, are they questions or just?
No.
Okay, well, thank you guys for your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
That will conclude the briefing, but now we're going to yield to Senator Carrozza.
So I appreciate the point of personal privilege, and I was hoping that those that are attending this briefing, as well as my colleagues, would join me in wishing Chair Feldman a happy birthday that we had yesterday. And I wanted, what's that? Okay, so we're gonna wish him a happy birthday, but I wanted to bring you something in person here, Chair Feldman. You said you liked the chocolates from Dolly, so here they come.
This morning, I was going to do the birthday wishes on the floor, and our co-chair of the Protocol Committee did it there, and I thought, surely I'll just do it in committee. And now Senator Carrozza beat me to it. So Senator Pinsky, the former chair, and I used to pun a lot. So I wanted to wish a happy birthday to the senator who provides healing support on health care issues, is high on the list of experts when it comes to cannabis, and he totally knows what's up when it comes to energy issues. And so I was going to wish, on behalf of the Senate, a punny happy birthday to our chair on Saturday.
Okay, well, thank you to everybody. With that said, I've been instructed that we need to take a 10-minute break before we transition for some rebooting technical stuff. Or 10 minutes, be back here. We'll start our 3 bill hearings, and then we'll move right after that to a voting session. So 10 minutes, be back here in the committee room. So thank you.